Hi everyone, welcome to week 14, our second to last week of the semester, and this week we're talking about social stratification and inequality. And as usual, you hear me say this, often, pretty much every week. There's strong links to the previous week's material in particular. So the corresponding chapter this week, as with the last few weeks, chapter matches the week. Chapter 14, what can anthropology tell us about social groups and inequality? So let's jump right in. You might remember, if you've been watching these, if you've been following these slides, this reminder has been with us for quite a few weeks now. So just a reminder that this topic is part of this wider web of topics that we've been dealing with on social organization. So all these things that we've dealt with in the past few weeks, economic systems, how people get and share resources, systems around power and decision making, which was last week's topic, kinship, how people create families, ideas about gender and sexuality, are linked to this week's topic. And I've mentioned stratification a few times here and there, especially last week when we were talking about political systems. So, everything's connected. And this topic kind of wraps up the social organization component of the course. And next week we're ending on kind of a fun note, I think, which is, how humans create meaning. Because everything we've talked about, in the end, humans create meaning for their existence, and that's where we're going to end the semester. So, let's jump right in. So, what's social stratification? The word stratification itself is about placement in layers. So you hear this term sometimes even in, say, archaeology, when one of the many, many techniques by which archaeologists can try to figure out how old something is stratification. I mean, with stratification, they can only really tell how old things are compared to other things. So how deep are they buried in the ground? And of course, that's not a perfect system because over the past millions of years, there are many things that have happened, earthquakes, all kinds of things, floods that have shifted things around, but it's kind of one way, right? So that's stratification. You're looking at layers of things. So when we're talking about social stratification, we're essentially looking at layers of people, right? So stratification exists in societies where groups of people are kind of ranked with respect to each other. Now, the ties with political organization here are very, very close. I mean, it's almost one big topic, because if you remember last week when we were looking at these different systems of political organization, it has to do with power, right? Decision-making power and so on. And we learned about societies where there weren't really any formal systems of governance and people were more egalitarian. We were talking about small groups of people, and we looked at a spectrum of systems of organization ranging all the way to nation states or state societies, which is what a lot of us are used to, where you have, a government and they're pretty much making all the rules and people can kind of protest and do whatever they want. But at the end of the day, the government decides what the government is going to decide, and they act out their decisions through force if needed, like the police force, and a penal system and a set of laws. So so we are at a stratified society where you have some people who have more access to wealth and power and prestige. There should be an L there. No, it's not working. Okay. Fix it later, as usual. You must be used to my typos by now at the end of the semester. So, you have people in those top layers who have more access to wealth and power and prestige, and people in the bottom rungs who have a lot less, sometimes none even. And so, and this is, again, sometimes people might think, oh, Jackie's being all left-wing again. This is observations. This is sociological and anthropological observations, historical observations that this does indeed exist. We'll talk a bit more about that trifecta of wealth, power, and privilege a little later. But one thing that we can see as well is that there's an overlap between this stratification system and categorizations based on, say, perceived gender, perceived race. So a lot of these inequalities that exist, different, access to wealth, power, and prestige, we'll be talking about class a lot, like socioeconomic class, but there's also other factors. I said gender and race here because these are things we've talked about, but we can throw in a lot of other factors here, like intellectual and physical ability, age, all kinds of things. So there are different things that will kind of give people more opportunities to obtain wealth, and some people less. So that's stratification. And often, that there's an ideology that goes with that. And we saw that with political organization, where it's harder to maintain power through force and coercion than it is by influencing the mindset of a population. So in societies like Canadian society, let's face it, has stratification, and there's kind of a naturalizing discourse very often around it. Sure, some people will complain about it, but then say things like, oh, well, that's humanity, that's what it is to be human. There's always been rich and poor people, it's always been that way, and it always will. And by now you must know how I feel about statements like this, and I'm not alone. And in this chapter, the authors actually talk about these naturalizing discourses, which, are ways of thinking that are very common, and it doesn't mean people are stupid and ignorant. These are shortcut ways of thinking, and a lot of people just, unless you're a scholar and you're in academia and you just love thinking about this stuff, you're a person trying to survive, trying to get your work done, and maybe with an annoying boss, maybe with annoying customers, maybe you're dealing with heartbreak or discord in the family, or you're dealing with a pandemic. You just don't put much thought into it, right? Unless you're specializing in these fields of thinking. So it's just easiest to go, yeah, that's just the way it is, and it's always been that way. And there are links here with, for example, like gender essentialism, which we talked about a few weeks ago. This idea that there's something about gender that just comes from our biology, that there are these grand differences between women and men, and there are only women and men, and this is like a biological reality, and all the gender ideas that people have about women being passive and soft and nurturing and men being aggressive and strong, that there's something natural about this. That's an example of a naturalizing discourse, all right? When we talked way back when about at some point in history how some scholars kind of came up with this scheme of things where they could categorize humans into races, and now we know there's no scientific basis for that categorization. There are still some biologists and even some anthropologists here and there who still maintain that there are human races, but for the most part it's like, no, there's no scientific backup. But in popular, again, just everyday people, just it's easier to just believe that there are races. Again, the idea that I mentioned is people who will say, oh well, it's not fair, but that's just the way it is. And it's just, now it might seem benign or harmless to have these naturalizing discourses, because maybe in everyday life when people are struggling, it's just easier to think that and just let it go and trudge along with your life. But they're actually dangerous, okay, because they can, we've mentioned in this course how scholars are humans and therefore biased, and sometimes their biases have influenced the way that they've interpreted data. And so, they even mention in the text in this chapter where, some anthropologists have fallen prey to these naturalizing discourses about certain things, and sometimes that leads to misinterpretations of things. And the thing is that science isn't done just for the fun of it. Well, for some people it is. But a lot, the idea is to kind of also influence society and policy and make the world a more fair place, at least for some of us. That was our reason for going into the social sciences. So a lot of policy is made, for example, based on how people see the world, right? And that's the case in any culture, right? How people see the world, their worldview, which we'll talk more about next week to wrap up our course, really shapes how people perceive reality, whether it be about gender or race or any other kind of thing, right? And so these naturalizing discourses are dangerous because when they're in the minds of decision makers in society, they can lead to some pretty busted policies. We're seeing this here. Policies, laws that are going through that are really problematic. We see it with issues like systemic racism, where you have laws in place that wind up acting in discriminatory ways, even though they're meant to be neutral. So they're dangerous, and that's why anthropologists spend a lot of time denouncing them. You know, you've spent a semester with me, you know that sometimes I get riled up about some of these kinds of things, like gender essentialism and racism and things like that, because I really do feel that they're dangerous. And a lot of people with hate in their hearts, a lot of people like white supremacists, male supremacists, other people like that who are, you know, you can go back and look at, you know, the Nazi Party and other kind of groups that have tried to eliminate other groups of people, the KKK and whatnot. They've held on to these ideas, and they've actually caused a lot of harm. I mean, they've caused a lot of deaths, and people are still suffering from that today. And, you know, so anyway, enough about, you know, I'm going on my soapbox here, but I really want to drive home the importance of thinking more critically when you hear these simplistic ideas. If you forget anything in this course, but you remember the idea of cultural relativism and the idea that you need to kind of think in a deeper way about these naturalizing discourses, I will be a happy camper. If you write to me in 10 years and say, Jackie, that's all I remember from your course and I'm applying it in my everyday life, I'll be like, aw, I've done my job. So, what are the problems with these naturalizing discourses other than what I said? Well, this is tied into what I said. They ignore three important things, and the authors point this out and they elaborate on this. So I suggest that you read those two paragraphs. They ignore historical changes in human social structures, okay? So meaning that people will say things like, oh, the nuclear family and monogamous marriage and heterosexual marriage and the respective roles of women and men and rich and poor, like it's always been this way since the beginning of time. Dum, 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 dum. I do that because a lot of you start your essays like that. Please don't. I'm begging you to please not start your essay with "since the beginning of time." It's very melodramatic and it's not needed. The other one is "in today's society." Please don't do that. Please. Okay, so yeah, back to the point here. The naturalizing discourses ignore that there have been changes, and of course, you know, we've talked about this with evolution. There are misconceptions about what early human societies were like. These naturalizing discourses also ignore cultural variation when it comes to social organization. So everything we've been talking about in the past few weeks, including this topic of stratification, not every society is organized the same way everywhere in the world, okay? So, you know, people who have these ideas that, oh, things have always been this one way, family structures or gender, they're kind of basing their ideas in their own culture, very often Western society at large, which includes a lot of cultures, but there are some trends here, namely, you know, patriarchy, for example, white supremacy are a couple that come to mind, and they're not taking into account that, you know, there are other cultures with other ways of doing things, and if you're saying that things have always been your way, you're kind of ignoring that there are other humans doing things other ways at this very moment. And it kind of ignores these naturalizing discourses also ignore, I would say obscure even, the existence of current social inequalities that kind of emerge from contemporary social structures, right? So this is kind of linked to the other two in the sense that when you look at just the history of where we are right now with colonialism and slavery and racist immigration policies, there are social inequalities that kind of are directly related to those things that have happened just in the past few centuries. I know a few centuries sounds like a long time when most of us don't live one century, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not very long considering we've been around for hundreds and thousands of years, just our species. That's not counting all the other hominins, all right? So, yeah, bottom line, I know I've gone on about this for a good 10 minutes now, but they're not good. Try to think more critically about them. So how does that relate to this topic of stratification? Well, societies that are heavily stratified often rely heavily on these naturalizing discourses to get people to think that, well, this is the way that it is, and this is the way that it has to be, and it's the only way that it can be. right? So when people kind of like myself rant about social inequalities and people just say, well, that's just the way it is, Jackie, you just gotta roll with it. It's like, well, you're engaging in a naturalizing discourse and you're making it seem okay and normal and natural, and it's not. It doesn't have to be that way. But that's what people wind up doing to justify in their minds and in the minds of others how things are, whether it be patriarchy or racism or homophobia or any other kind of discrimination. So, stratification versus egalitarianism. So, this is important to recall again as a link with last week's material, is that there are, and there are less and less of them because of forces like colonization around the world and imperialism and global capitalism. There are and have been forever some societies that have existed on an egalitarian model where there's no ranking, and everybody in that society, and these are small societies so it's easier to maintain this, everybody has access to what they need to survive. There's sharing. So when we talked about modes of exchange and modes of distribution, we talked about reciprocity, right? That works well in these contexts. People avoid hoarding because that's not seen as a very good thing, because you're keeping other people from accessing what they need to survive. And there's no formal authority or power. So if you look at, again, last week's material, we talked about this, right? So there's some stark differences there. And so, okay, again, we don't see a lot of societies like this in the world today, but they have existed, so it's not impossible. All right, and just some quick comparisons here, like in terms of how things work in an egalitarian society. Decisions are made by consensus. Any leadership is informal, so there's no overt power over other people. Everybody's work is considered valuable and complementary. So whether you're cooking a meal or actually going out and getting the food or doing some other stuff, it's all important. It's all recognized. We already mentioned reciprocity. Some healers might have a bit more prestige, and we'll talk about, again, that prestige versus power versus wealth thing in a slide that's yet to come. Prestige is like people look up to you a little bit. Maybe you don't necessarily have power, but you may have influence. People kind of, it's a bit of glory, so to speak. You're seen as an important person. These societies have informal sanctions, so instead of codified laws and rules that say, oh, you did this, therefore you have this punishment, it might be more, gossipy, kind of people will avoid you for a while because you're hoarding and you're not sharing or that sort of thing. Whereas stratified societies, such as chiefdoms and states, you start to have, classes, right? And we're going to talk about the concept of class soon. And the higher classes, the wealthiest classes, tend to be the ones with more decision-making power. I mean, let's face it, to become a politician, yeah, you can, some working class or middle class people might make it, but a lot of the top politicians that you know of come from very wealthy families, right, who have access to all the top quality private schools as when they're in high school, and therefore kind of have inroads to some of the top ranking universities and things like that. It's a perpetuating system. Different occupations are valued differently, right? So, somebody who is a politician, a lawyer, a doctor is more highly valued because of their profession than somebody working at McDonald's or somebody collecting the garbage or plumbers. And so it's different, right? It's like all these things need to be done, but they're not valued the same. So unequal access to what people need to survive. Prestige is tied to wealth and power here, right? So I keep saying this, so I'll say it now, even though it's on a future slide. That trifecta, wealth, power, and prestige, they don't go together in every society. In the economic slides back a few weeks ago, we talked about the potlatch in some First Nations communities on the West Coast, for example, where you have societies where there are chiefs, but the chiefs there, it looks like they're hoarding for a while, they're collecting a lot of stuff, but then they're expected to give it all away, right? And that's how they raise their prestige. The respect that people will have for them is based on how much they give away. So they don't wind up with tons of wealth that stays with them, right? It's not meant for them, whatever they're collecting, and they don't necessarily have like kind of huge amounts of power over other people, right? Whereas the society we're in, it's stratified in such a way that, you know, if you're in the top rungs of society, you have all three of those things: prestige, wealth, and power, because prestige and power are tied to wealth. The more money you have, the more power you're likely to be able to access, because you might run a big, even if you're not a politician, you're running a big corporation that influences the government. We know that the governments that we have tend to cater to those corporations. We've seen it with COVID, right? And they'll also have more prestige. They'll go places and people fawn all over them. Ah, can I shine your shoes, right? Stratified societies have formal laws, and they're enforced through military and through police, okay? And we'll go back even further in the semester here, and I'll remind you of some links with the field of archaeology, where, you know, there's a history of stratification where early societies were small nomadic foraging societies. They weren't storing food, they had smaller populations, more likely to be egalitarian, as we just described, because it makes sense in that context. And again, they didn't disappear, right? It's just some of those early societies at some point kind of started practicing forms of agriculture or other things. Some people continued to practice a foraging way of life. It doesn't make them less evolved. They just kept adapting in their own way to their environment. And so then when you start to see some societies that start practicing agriculture, especially larger scale agriculture later on, because those early planting societies or who practiced, you know, small scale cultivation, they were still pretty egalitarian. As, you know, more recent societies that have practiced small scale agriculture have been relatively egalitarian, you know. So then when you started to get like this large scale agriculture with larger populations, you start to have the accumulation of stuff. Food storage is possible, again, larger populations, and then some families can manage to store more and hoard and take power over other people. And then you start to have over time the institutionalization of these power differences. So there's archaeological evidence of this. So it's not, you know, stratification started to emerge in those contexts. So again, when people have that naturalizing discourse of, oh, it's always been this way, well, no, actually. So you see the holistic connections there? Like, you know, I keep coming back with that first slide. Remember, this is all connected. You see here, like, the mode of subsistence and the level of mobility that people have, this, you know, is tied to their population size, right? Because you need to maintain a certain population size to be able to maintain, for example, a foraging way of living, with being able to kind of move throughout a territory on a seasonal basis. Remember, nomads are not aimless wanderers forever. They circulate within a given territory, so nomad is not necessarily the best term. You know, the mode of distribution, again, small population, it's easier to maintain a system of reciprocity. It's easier to maintain an informal political system. Gender roles tend to be more egalitarian as well. The value of work and resources is different depending on all these other things. You know, so that's what we've been talking about here, the difference between stratified systems and egalitarianism. So everything's connected. You can kind of think, if you hear about a society with a certain way of living and a certain kind of population size, and you can kind of infer some of these other things. Again, there's variation, right? And there are different ways of doing things, and these are not kind of rigid boxes, because the world doesn't conform to the categories that scientists create. But you can see some patterns, okay? And as we'll see next week, you know, the way people make meaning for the world is tied, sometimes will kind of help explain all of this for people. So social classes, they've come up a couple of times. So social classes are, you know, kind of groupings of people. Again, we're talking about stratification. So groupings of people with different access to economic wealth. So higher classes have more access to wealth, and with that higher access to wealth comes more opportunities. As I've mentioned, you know, different schools you have access to, different healthcare, different housing, different employment, certain entitlements to be in certain places, right? more power, which I've discussed. These things go with wealth, prestige, so I already discussed that kind of trifecta there. Um, and as I mentioned before, in some cultures, power, prestige, and wealth are not tied with each other. But in the society that we're in, they definitely are. And so again, to counter those naturalizing discourses, there's variation in how class societies even work, right? Through history, there's been changes. So there's some discussion in the textbook of even just European history, right, with the feudal system and things like that. There's variation across culture, so there are different cultures in the world that have some kind of class system, but it looks differently. The textbook goes a little bit into the caste system, for example, in the Hindu religion and how that's connected, and some of the different kind of groupings that happen there. So if you want to learn more about that, you can read that as well. So the different kind of class system than what people growing up in Canada are used to, for example. So open versus closed classes. So the textbook doesn't really phrase things in these terms, but this is often what you see in anthropology textbooks. If you have an open class system, often anthropologists and sociologists talk about that with reference to class systems where there can be a degree of mobility. It's theoretically possible, at least. So, again, if you think about Canadian society, one of the very popular media tropes is the rags to riches story, right? You grow up in a poor family and you make it despite all the odds and you become a millionaire, Yeah, that's not impossible. Is it likely? All right. It's way easier to go down than up, and even there, So if you're born into a wealthy family, and if you somehow, I don't know, gamble away all your wealth, or you make bad investments and you wind up poor, you still have those social networks. Some of them might continue talking to you. Some of them might help you. If you watch Schitt's Creek, actually, it's not spelt shit, but SCHITT apostrophe S Creek. It's a lovely show, and some good queer content, but also, this family that was very wealthy and winds up very poor, and they have to go live in this town that at one point they had purchased, and all their rich friends aren't talking to them anymore. So it's easier to go down than up. So, the thing is, though, and there's a section in the textbook on social classes in Canada, and they talk about this idea that, a lot of people like to have this utopian vision of Canada where, it's an open, we don't even have classes here, everybody's equal before the law, but actually barriers do operate in systemic as well as informal ways. They're not always overt, right? So things like systemic racism, certain how our society is structured in terms of, say, benefits. If you're poor and you wind up on unemployment and then on welfare, the amount you make doesn't get you very far. You probably can't even pay your rent and all your bills and still eat. Right? So it doesn't make it easy, and then you might not even have a Metro pass. You go to job interviews, and you might not have the money to buy clothing to go to those interviews. And then if you show up in tattered clothes to an interview, you're not likely to get the job, right? So there's all these little things, and discrimination against certain people, right? So that idea that this is a completely open class societies where all the possibilities are there, and if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can make it. It's not as easy as it sounds. Whereas closed classes, mobility is nearly impossible. There's actually all kinds of regulations that keep people from different classes from moving to other classes. So there might be sanctions against mixing, even talking to each other, or between intermarriage. When somebody is born into their class, sometimes, you think about caste systems, and you're born into it, and that's your identity pretty much for life. So, it's more overt in that case. Whereas in our supposed open class society, there's no law that says a rich person and a poor person can't marry. But how likely are they to even meet in the first place? Right? So it's not like an overt rule, but it's just the way things are structured make it unlikely. Okay, so that's what happens often in an open class system, or a supposed open class system. So this is, we get into it a bit here, more here in that section from the textbook that deals with classes in Canada. Again, I already mentioned this utopian view, everybody's equal, right? But you know, there's these systemic barriers that I mentioned, often along the lines of perceived race, for example, and they continue to exist. So the colonial history and present, and I say and present because colonialism hasn't ended. Canada is still a colony. The colonizers never left, and Indigenous people still have not had their sovereignty respected in the past few centuries. Okay, so things like the Indian Act continue to place barriers. If you don't know what the Indian Act is, it's a piece of law that has existed since Canada has been a country that legislates the identity of First Nations people. Okay, in the past, some of their traditional gatherings and activities were banned. All kinds of things. It's, you should, if you live here, you need to know this, and unfortunately, they don't teach about it in schools very much. I teach a course on Native peoples of the Americas every winter, so you can take that if you want to know more. Or yeah, I can send you some links. Immigration policies that have existed, right, have had very sometimes overt and sometimes more covert racist overtones. I already talked about this of, like, you know, if you're born into poverty, there are a bunch of barriers there that make it very difficult to access education, employment, housing, and healthcare. And even if you say, oh yeah, education and healthcare, for example, are free in Quebec, well, you don't always get the highest quality. All right. Racism. So racism also fits into this idea of stratification because, you know, as we've seen in previous material many weeks ago, although there's no scientific basis for the existence of human races, race still exists as a cultural or social category based on perceptions of humans. So again, you have people who will look at physical differences between people who, you know, have maybe lineages, roots in different parts of the world and therefore look different, and in a lot of people's minds they're still kind of putting people in boxes based on that, right? So, you know, black, white, Asian, those are the three big ones, right, that we tend to hear about, which leaves out a heck of a lot of people. And also, as we've seen, within those broad groups there's as much variation as there is between them. So we know that these are socially constructed categories, all right, but they're still very powerful. So just because you hear students sometimes, I heard students say, well, if there are no races, then how can there be racism? There is still racism because, yes, race exists as a social category. People perceive them, people invented them, and they act on that. So racism is there, and it's based on social and cultural perceptions that people have, all right, especially people in power. And in the North American context, especially white people, okay? Now, don't start getting mad at me if you're white and you're thinking, I'm not racist. Well, we all kind of are a little bit, in the sense that we're part of a system that is racist, and we benefit from the racial oppression of people who aren't like us. Even if you don't know it, at some point you are benefiting from that. Now, it doesn't mean that you've had an easy life. You might have been born poor. I was born into a poorer family, not poor, but definitely not wealthy. We've had our own struggles. So it doesn't mean that you've had all the privileges, but it just means that you haven't faced barriers specific to your skin color, all right? So that's a reality, and again, it's observable, all right? So racism winds up having very real world impact that kind of ties into this stratification. It doesn't mean, for example, that you have no wealthy people of color, no wealthy black people, no wealthy indigenous people, and that you don't have any poor white people, okay? It's just that in the grand scheme of things, that when you look at poorer populations, black, indigenous, and people of color are overrepresented in those populations, not because there's something wrong with them, but because of this ongoing history, and I say ongoing history, so it's still going on, of racial oppression, all right, and discrimination. So there's this intersection with class in that sense. And yeah, like I mentioned, people of different so-called races can be a part of different classes. Again, that's not the point. It's just like who's represented, right? So higher classes, you'll have some people of color there, but overwhelmingly white. All right. So yeah, access to the privileges of the higher classes are harder to access for BIPOC people, again, due to the things I mentioned, right? Not impossible, again, but just different forms of discrimination kind of wind up acting on people. We could say that again about ableism and other kinds of discrimination, but I think racism is definitely one of the big ones that has a massive impact on society, as the others do, but I think this one is kind of easier in some ways to identify. Not that it's always obvious, okay, but for, what's interesting is that I'm saying this as an anthropologist. I'm saying this as somebody with white skin who doesn't deal with this, but most of what I've learned about this hasn't been in textbooks. It's only in the past few years that, say, anthropology textbooks are really addressing the systemic nature of this, maybe 10 years. But before then, you wouldn't hear about this stuff in anthropology. You would hear it by going into activist circles, okay? And there have always been academics, especially academics who were Black, Indigenous, and people of color, speaking out about this, but they weren't necessarily taken seriously in academia. Okay, and so I'm saying all this, and I realize that, a lot of my students have direct experience of this, so I'm probably preaching to the converted, and I guess sometimes when I'm really adamant about all this is because I've had reactions, I've had backlash from white students before on this, right? Whereas a lot of other folks are like, yeah, we deal with this every day, right? So just kind of keep those things in mind here. If you're not from a racialized group and this sounds like it's over the top, maybe take some time to listen to your peers, to people on social media who are Black, who are Indigenous, or people of color, speaking about their own realities, okay? So human rights and culture. So this is kind of our last, again, as with every week, there's so much in the textbook that's interesting to read, but we can't talk about it all. So I kind of am ending on this. They have a few pages of discussion on this, so I'm very much oversimplifying this discussion, okay? So just keep that in mind. So if you want all the nuance, you'll have to kind of go read that last section of the chapter that has this whole discussion of human rights. So in stratified societies, no matter where you go, you'll have people with more power, more wealth, and you'll have people maybe dealing with situations of poverty, or at least less access to wealth, less power, less autonomy, more subject to the whims of the people in power, and often that will tie into kind of patriarchal systems as well. And so there are things that happen in the world that come across as human rights violations to some people, and to other people they're seen as normal, okay? So there's this whole discussion of if you enforce human rights, so this idea that every single human in the world deserves access to what they need to live. They deserve to be healthy and happy and have their dignity, right? And there are people who say, well, yeah, but then if you have cultures that don't believe that, then you can't enforce it because then you're going against their culture. So there's this idea that there's a false idea that advocating for human rights can actually go against culture. Now, it's complex. Again, we're not going to, in the few minutes that I have to go over this slide, it's a gross oversimplification because, the very beginning of the semester, we talked, for example, about female genital cutting, and the responses to that were very strong and very emotional, and it makes sense because if you're not from a culture that practices this, it's going to be like, it's appalling. And you know what? One of the things we talked about is that in those cultures, too, there are people who disagree with this and who'd been advocating for decades for changes. So the important thing that we said was that being culturally relative doesn't mean that you agree with this practice, doesn't mean that you like it, doesn't mean you're going to start doing it, but it means that you're able to try to understand the context that it comes from. and you're able to kind of step back and follow the lead of the people in that culture who are advocating for change. And so this section of the textbook kind of is a bit along of those same lines, where there's not necessarily a conflict between the idea of human rights and respecting culture, okay? Because what winds up happening is that if you see that as a conflict, there's an assumption that goes with that cultures are homogenous in their way of thinking, okay? And that's another naturalizing discourse. Yeah, when we talk about culture, we're talking about shared norms and values and stuff like that, but throughout this semester, we've always re-emphasized that there is individual variation in every single culture, and not everybody's going to relate to those shared norms and values in the same way. They might be interpreted differently, they might be practiced differently. And particularly in societies where you have stratification and big differences in power and wealth, then the people with all that power and wealth likely don't completely share the same values as the people who are in the bottom rungs. No matter how hard they try to enforce their ideology, there's mixed results there. So there's actually variation in belief and values, and that exists in all cultures, all right? So sometimes you got to be careful when you hear people say, oh, it goes against our culture, for example, to respect women. That's a big one, right? Or like in societies where, say, violence against women, domestic violence, things like that are seen as normal, right? So the people in power, so if that's a patriarchal, heavily stratified society, and the people in power, say men, are saying this, well, they it's easy for them to use the excuse of culture to say, oh, it's okay to beat our wives, for example, right? But it doesn't mean all those women agree. Some of them might have kind of come to accept it, but not all. And there's always some women who kind of advocate to fight back, and some men who support them, right? So culture is more nuanced than people think a lot of the time. And so, again, advocating for human rights isn't necessarily conflictual, right? So again, there's a lot of nuance missing here in this slide and what I'm presenting, but we're really just scratching the surface. And if any of you want to kind of dig into that, that would be a great topic for your final project, for example. The instructions, you've probably already seen the instructions by now. So kind of the final point here is that it is important to have cross-cultural discussion on the rights for all humans to access material wealth and safety and health and all those things that go together, because it doesn't have to be, again, a conflict between individual human rights and culture. Even if you have societies where culturally they're more community-based, or, I always forget the word, the opposite of individualistic, brain fart, I'm missing the word, but the opposite of individualism, collectivist, there we go, it came to me. So collectivist societies, sometimes people see them all, they're so rigid, and there's no individuality, and that's not really completely true. Most societies are kind of in the middle somewhere. They might skew more towards individualism or a bit more towards collectivism, but there's still a mix there. And again, like if you take First Nations societies in the north of Quebec and in places where I've spent time, their collectivism is very strong, people looking out for each other, and people helping each other and thinking of the collective, but everybody is seen as autonomous and nobody can tell somebody else what to do, right? So that's an interesting mix that sometimes gets missed in these discussions of collectivism versus individualism. And people assume that in collectivist societies nobody has individual rights, and that's a gross oversimplification and yet another naturalizing discourse. So on that note, we're going to end it here because there's so much more we could say, but again, tip of the iceberg. As usual, if you have any questions at all, please do let me know. You know how to reach me, and see you next week for one last set of slides. Woohoo!